So today I wanted to talk about ecosystem-based targets. I think a lot of Canadians know that there is a goal to protect 30% of Canada's land and marine areas by 2030, and an interim target to protect 25% by 2025. But having an overall protected areas target isn't enough. There needs to be legally binding targets for all ecosystem types in order to ensure that it's not just protection of the least contested landscapes that industry wants the least. For example, most protected areas being established right now are up in the Arctic and the subarctic, and in British Columbia there are plans to establish large protected areas in the alpine, the far north, the subalpine, areas without trees big enough to commercially log typically, and areas where the soils are not good enough to farm and the climate is too cold for most human habitation. So the most endangered ecosystems are precisely in the areas that have been impacted by agricultural conversion of landscapes where the soils and the climates are conducive, and most people want to live there in the big urban centers. Suburban sprawl threatens them, and where the trees grow big enough because the soils are rich enough and the climate is mild enough to grow commercially valuable trees. So most protected areas have evaded those ecosystems, the productive old growth forests like these in the valley bottoms and lower elevations in southern British Columbia, the deciduous forests of southern Ontario, the mixed forests of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence, the prairie grasslands, the aspen parkland, the southern ecosystems where the vast majority of endangered species exist have been disproportionately not protected compared to the Arctic, subarctic, alpine, subalpine, muskeg, northern boreal landscapes compared to the south. And so ecosystem-based targets means that scientists, as well as traditional ecological knowledge committees, First Nations, develop targets to ensure representation of the full diversity of ecosystems and their long-term viability, and that these should be legally binding to make sure these are not just advisory targets, but governments have got to actually meet them. And this is a game changer, because a battle is happening in the productive lowlands that grow the big trees in British Columbia's valley bottoms and in the southern ecosystems of Canada, where industry is most heavily targeting. There are some mining and some oil and gas and very intensive destruction in localized areas, but as per hectare, the most endangered ecosystems are in the south. So, to ensure representation, there has to be a fine enough filter, meaning that it's not just giant biomes like the boreal ecosystem, but broken down into ecosystems. Not just the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forests, but broken down into smaller ecosystems. For example, this is a very rare and endangered ecosystem where I am right now. Old-growth Sitka spruce with big leaf maple. Old-growth big leaf maple and old-growth Sitka spruce together is a very rare ecological community. The subzone and the variant here is this would be the sub-montane, very wet maritime, and the bigger ecosystem is the coastal western hemlock zone. So we've got to get all the way down to plant communities in terms of protection targets set by science, and we got to make sure that enough of it is protected to ensure that there are viable populations of species of all species, so they don't go extinct because of inbreeding or other disturbances, so that predator-prey relationships can flourish, so that watersheds for all the fisheries and the aquatic species can flourish, for evolutionary processes to continue, natural disturbance regimes, all age classes in their natural realm of distribution. So that the long-term viability is looking at all those factors together, and we need to represent all ecosystems. So, in other words, we need an Endangered Ecosystems Act, just like we need an Endangered Species Act with teeth. But for ecosystems, it's a more efficient way to do it. And in British Columbia, the government's looking potentially at establishing ecosystem-based protection targets through the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Health Framework. And nationally, the government's been taking input for a national biodiversity strategy for 2030. And both initiatives, as well as all across the provinces and territories, really require ecosystem-based protection targets to really be effective. So that's the game changer, and this is something that the conservation movement needs to become aware of, and Canadians in general, because if the goal is to protect biodiversity and ecosystems, then having targets for each ecosystem that house the diversity of biodiversity is fundamentally important. So let's make that happen.